so let's do this.
I have had quite a lot of praise for No More Heroes in the past. In particular, I admired the series' ability to provide occasional, but truly spectacular moments of action gameplay, and so I turned to this long-awaited return of Travis Touchdown with quite lofty expectations. I hoped, above all, to find great music, the traditional tongue-in-cheek humour that is a hallmark of Grasshopper manufacture, and above all, energetic and frenetic boss battles that, at their best, were some of the most engaging moments of gameplay I'd ever enjoyed. It's with surprise, therefore, that I can report that what I found wasn't quite what I was expecting, and going forward I hope to explain how my expectations were either surpassed, undermined, or subverted by No More Heroes 3, and in doing so, forming a conclusion on this latest intergalactic outing for the ultimate otaku assassin. No More Heroes 3 takes place over a decade after the conclusion of the previous entry, and despite the changes around Santa Destroy, following some science fiction hijinks, Travis Touchdown is once again predictably thrust into a sequence of fights under the guise of what is now referred to as the Galactic Superhero Rankings. This is a good opportunity to address a criticism that occurred to me rather quickly after the initial joy of returning to Santa Destroy faded. For a series that makes so much fun of mainstream tropes in entertainment, it is ultimately a little disappointing to see No More Heroes retread a formula of its own with such little deviation from the series' structural backbone. I even held out as the game progressed in the vague hope that there would be a worthwhile surprise waiting for me in the tail, but this ultimately proved fruitless. On a separate but related front, the world of Santa Destroy is now significantly expanded to include new areas and developments that have been added since previous games. Expanding this part of the game definitely deserves credit, at least in an attempt to redeem the vision of the first entry in the series, but it's never really clear what meaningful contribution this makes to the game, apart from adding extra scale to an open world that many critics considered unnecessary to begin with. While I am somewhat torn on this point, I found that these new areas have far less personality than the original Santa Destroy in No More Heroes 1, with its mix of sand, scorpions and solitude that was quite novel to gaming at the time. On top of this, there is also a certain sense that by expanding the game in this way, No More Heroes 3 imports a set of well-worn open-world issues on top of its own tropes. This includes bland collectibles, unlocking new checkpoints, and somewhat copy-and-paste side missions, though longtime fans know that this last bit is not exactly new. It's also worth noting that No More Heroes 3 generally includes many quality-of-life features over the originals, and I mention this here because, first and foremost among them, is fast travel. Unfortunately, however, exploration has never been a true focus of the series, so fast travel becomes a way of hopping from place to place and skipping a lot of the game areas that have been added. In this way, players may start to notice a degree of conflict to the vision for the open areas. At this point, it may seem that I've adopted a somewhat disappointed tone so far, but I assure you that any disappointment I feel must be understood within the context of my desire to see a genuine evolution of the series. A desire which I must admit is probably a bit of a stretch considering just how long a hiatus the series has taken and the relative point of Goichi Suda in his career. Going forward, therefore, I'll try to cast this review in a more modest light and will do my best to judge No More Heroes 3 as a welcome return to a series that hasn't seen a new entry in years. With this newly acquired lens, it's fair to say that No More Heroes 3 does its job rather well. Firstly, this is easily the best No More Heroes combat has looked and felt. The series' core action gameplay was engaging, if simplistic, and No More Heroes 3 combat remains clean, flashy and fun with some noticeable improvements in specific areas. As I mentioned in previous reviews in the series, the simplicity of combat often shifted the emphasis from what you could do onto what you were dealing with, and in this way, the game's simple combat tools were never a negative. At its best, these tools stressed a reactive style by placing emphasis on adapting to boss patterns and broader combat dynamics. By far the biggest mechanical addition to No More Heroes 3, therefore, is the Death Glove, a set of 4 combat moves that can be used to deal additional damage through AoE, to interrupt enemy attacks, and most importantly for No More Heroes, to add a very welcome increase in mobility to the series' combat, the immediate effect of which is to inject a brand new level of dynamism and proactivity to No More Heroes 3. Another very clear point of improvement is enemy variety. No More Heroes 3 opts to avoid the instances of linear level design from previous games in the series, and replaces it with what it calls designated matches. These are a series of mandatory PvE encounters that are required to be undertaken before each boss encounter, and take place in fairly standard enemy arenas, but generally revolve around a unique enemy or somewhat novel combination of them. On one hand, this creates more interesting encounter combinations than previously by mixing elusive, ranged enemies with aggressive, close quarters foes, and especially initially, there is a joy to be found flying around dispatching these foes as quickly and flawlessly as possible and getting to grips, pun intended, with the Death Glove. After a while, however, it becomes more clear that none of these encounters are so unique that they become truly memorable despite these new tools and enemy combos. On top of this, what is gained by isolating and focusing the combat in these instances, the game loses some of what the more linear levels from previous entries could give in terms of anticipation or climax before a boss encounter, and even to an extent they lose a degree of world building that could be built up as Travis wound his way through areas of importance to whatever assassin he happened to be hunting. As a result, it's unfortunate to say that it's hard to consider this a truly significant upgrade over previous entries, apart from their capacity to offer a new opportunity to flex your thumbs with the newly dynamic combat tools. Moreover, the insistence on building the game around 3 designated matches before each boss echoes an earlier point I've made about the game lacking much in terms of structural surprise or novelty. Okay, so we now know that the combat tools are smoother, cleaner and flashier than they were, but let's get to the heart of the matter. Boss encounters have always been the crown jewel of No More Heroes, and both main series games always had 1 or 2 boss encounters that I felt coalesced through a combination of their level, combat, enemy, sound, and even theme and aesthetic design into truly peak gaming moments. Unfortunately, No More Heroes 3 doesn't quite strike the same high notes, but this area is still the game's strongest. No More Heroes 3 presents the most consistent and polished set of boss encounters the series ever had. There's nothing awkward, nothing clunky, just well-designed opportunities that ask the player to mix the traditional No More Heroes combat elements, like its perfect dodge and roulette wheel mechanics, with the new Death Glove mobility options. As has always been the case, the tightest and most enjoyable boss encounters are always the humanoid encounters with more aggressive AI and faster attack patterns. But No More Heroes 3 also contains a few surprises in its boss encounters that are definitely welcome. These are nothing groundbreaking by any means, but are fun and engaging enough to at least convey that the game was treated with love. As I've mentioned, although this is clearly one of the game's strongest suits, it's also here that it becomes evident that there is one area from which No More Heroes 3 departs from previous entries. It's quite easy. Normal difficulty is rather straightforward, and previous entries in the series, especially during boss encounters, relied on quite a high degree of difficulty to really engage players with the enemy design and ground them in the moment in oftentimes long and intense clashes. While these always flirted with frustrating, it is worth noting that I felt that this was a key to delivering the peak experience that were on offer in previous entries. There's one last element that I want to discuss in relation to No More Heroes 3 as an action game. I've mentioned many separate elements of combat design, but there is one last systematic layer that I want to discuss. What I'm referring to is No More Heroes 3's system of combat scores or combat rankings. While I'm generally in favour of such systems for how they can help to engage the player more deeply with the game's mechanics or systems, in games like Arkham Asylum or Metal Gear Solid 5, these can teach the player to derive more intrinsic enjoyment from combat by using an extrinsic system to reward a higher level of skill. But in No More Heroes 3, receiving a top rank is generally just a matter of minimizing damage taken. Never do these score systems, for example, necessitate swift, high-risk, incisive play, and never requires much beyond using Death Glove skills on cooldown, quickly learning boss patterns, and then using your Death Glove skills to interrupt their attacks to avoid damage entirely. In this way, it can become strategically quite bland. Okay, so I've spoken enough on the game's combat. It's good, even if it leaves me wanting just a little more. Nonetheless, there are still many positive things that are left for me to discuss. A key element of No More Heroes has always been the side tasks. These were always a great source of joy, and were initially designed to poke fun at the bizarre gigs or side hustles Travis needed to undertake to fund his otaku lifestyle and qualify for each assassin ranking bout. As such a central ingredient, these side tasks of course return in No More Heroes 3, and I think on the whole they retain their appeal and recapture their strange comic tone that added so much to the series. Nonetheless, it's here that keen-eyed players might see a re-emergence of a theme we've discussed before, of No More Heroes 3 relying a little bit too much on the series formula, and thus may not provide quite the thrills that coconut collecting once did. No More Heroes is also still quite funny, and fan favourite Travis Touchdown is as great a foil as he ever has been, and manages to retain that strange mix of sinister, pathetic and heroic without diminishing a beloved character in any way, quite an impressive feat for a 15-year-old idea. On top of this, No More Heroes 3 is both the most visually polished the series has looked, inside and outside of combat, and also the most aesthetically unique. As I've mentioned, even though other parts of Utopialand are not as distinct as Santa Destroy, much of the interstitial elements of No More Heroes 3 really pop, even if there can be minor irritations like being unable to see what side quest you're doing before choosing it. Nonetheless, all of this adds quite a splash of colour that distinguishes it a lot from previous entries in the series. On a brief technical aside, I played this game on PlayStation 4 and can report that it ran quite well and looked very good, although I did experience one crash during the driving mini-game, so my technical experience was largely positive, though I cannot speak for other versions of the game. As I mentioned above, there are many very welcome quality of life features in No More Heroes 3. Fast travel makes jumping around Utopialand a breeze, and New Game Plus was always a highly requested feature. The most welcome addition of all, however, is a time machine underneath the No More Heroes motel that allows players to rematch past bosses to earn better rankings and adjust difficulty levels when they've cleared the game. Finally, I was surprised at just how much service No More Heroes 3 does for series fans in terms of story. Though I have no particular in-depth knowledge of the series lore, I did notice a lot of recurring characters who seem to have been treated with respect, as opposed to seeming totally like fan service. And while the exact direction the story takes has always been secondary to how the story explores the nuances of Travis Touchdown as an individual, in No More Heroes 3 there are quite a few moments that demonstrate an obvious character maturation for Travis that some may find satisfying, if indeed that was the direction you wanted Travis to go. But for others, it might represent how the series again may have slightly lost its edge. Ultimately, I'm quite conflicted. I enjoyed No More Heroes 3, but I also enjoyed No More Heroes 1 and 2, and can still intimately recall what made them special. No More Heroes 3 is a strange inversion of previous entries. In many ways, it's the best game in the series. It's the best looking, the most approachable, and the most consistent, but doesn't quite provide the same dizzying but unsustainable highs of what came before. In this way, your opinion of the game relies on how you choose to judge No More Heroes 3. Either a welcome and light-hearted series return, or a relatively safe entry that's missing a spark. My own love for the series, and the genuine enjoyment I gleaned from simply returning to Travis Touchdown, allowed me to still appreciate it for what it is, but despite it being the most polished entry in the series, I still cannot fully shift the feeling I have that as time has gone on, the series may have lost some of its edge, energy, and heart.